Hi, everyone. Welcome to All the Forbidden Things. Today, I am joined by Clifford Brown. He's the former USAID mission director in a number of countries and the author of Inside USAID, an Odyssey of Foreign Assistance. So, we're going to be talking today about the social consensus in a country and how that can lead to fragility when it falls apart. Things that he has discovered from his time abroad, seeing different regimes rise and fall, and then particularly what might be possible here in America, how different we really are from the third world, how fragile we are as a nation. So, thank you so much for being here. I'll pass it over to you to tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. I'm happy to be here. I hope I'm not one of the forbidden things, but happy to talk about USAID and my own background. I was a corporate lawyer in Los Angeles when in 1987 I saw an advertisement in a newspaper that wanted the Agency for International Development wanted attorneys that spoke another language. And I had Spanish at the time because I'd lived down there for a year between college and law school. And I always wanted to use it in my job. So it's a long story, but I took the job and took a big pay cut and went overseas eventually. And I was lucky enough or unlucky enough to live in a lot of very crazy places. I started off in D.C., but I was responsible for programs in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And I remember being sent down to Haiti right after the dictator of the country, Raul Cedras, had called out the army and literally shot people as they were standing in line to vote. About that same time, we were booted out of Panama by Manuel Noriega. We were given 24 hours to get our people out of there. And I knew Panama because I had traveled through it several times earlier in my student life, and I took the law school admissions test down in Panama. And then I ended up going to Africa. I was a regional legal advisor in East Africa for 3.5 years. And when I was there, a number of civil wars ended, one in Sudan, one in Somalia. I was in Zaire when it fell apart. Mobutu, who had been the dictator there for about more than 25 years, wasn't feeding his troops, and they rebelled, and I saw that society fall apart. I eventually got back to Latin America, so where I could use my Spanish finally, and I was in Nicaragua right after Daniel Ortega lost an election to Violeta Chamorro, when he lost power the first time. Well, he's back in power now, and that society has never been the same. It's very authoritarian, and all of our high hopes when Violeta Chamorro was elected were dashed. I was in Kyrgyzstan, and I was in fact the acting DCM, the deputy chief of the mission, because the real guy had gone on vacation, and the ambassador asked me if I would be his deputy during what turned out to be the Tulip Revolution, and that was the first time Kyrgyzstan fell apart. A couple of rent crowds got together in front of the presidential palace, and some of the guys figured out that the guards didn't have any ammunition. They climbed over the fence, and Kyrgyzstan fell apart that night. It was a completely chaotic situation. And then I was in Guinea when Lassana Conte, had been the dictator for about 20 years, and he died. And all of a sudden, factions within the military started fighting each other. We couldn't go to work. Non-essential staff got evacuated. I had been in Guatemala the very day the president there had ordered his army to arrest all of the Congress and the Supreme Court. It was Jorge Serrano. And that country almost fell apart, but for the fact that the U.S. made clear to the military that if this stood, that they were not going to be doing business with the United States. Anyway, I get into these stories in the book itself, and what I came to appreciate is how fast societies can fall apart. It's really quite frightening. And now I see in the U.S. this massive political distrust that we have, and I saw the situation in Michigan when the ICE agents were there defying the popular will. I saw the threat to Los Angeles when the National Guard troops were ordered there. And I live near DC, so I saw the National Guard troops here in DC, and it all reminds me of stuff I saw overseas. So that's really one of my messages right now, is that the social consensus is far more fragile than people realize. And we're very lucky in this country that we've held together so long. We're very lucky.
You know, I'd be interested to hear what you think has caused us to hold on so long. And with that, the idea that we feel like, oh, the US is this really unique bastion of freedom, this really special country. That's a feeling that's strongly held. And yeah, I mean, how much do you think that's true and has been true and has kind of held us up, and how much do you think that's not true at all compared to third world countries?
Well, it certainly was true for many years, with a few exceptions during the Civil War. We obviously came very close to falling apart there, basically because of the disagreement over slavery. But apart from that, we've been unique. I mean, partly leave aside for the time being the effect that both disease and human cruelty had on the Indians who lived here at first, the Native Americans. We attracted a unique breed of people from Europe that were more adventurous, and precisely because they came from different places, many of them were in the same boat, and we were tremendously successful for reasons that certainly were related to the initiative that these immigrants brought to the country, but also geography. It was a tremendous advantage to be as large as we were and have the natural resources that we had, and we still have, and the location that we had, which was necessarily protected from European wars and even Asian wars, and we didn't have aggressive neighbors, so we were allowed to develop, we were able to develop, and we, I think, rightly became very proud of what we've created, and that has held us together. We also, it was a strongly religious society, and I think religion played a very important role in holding us together as long as it did. There were less class distinctions here. And because we were a federal system, the states were allowed, and our Constitution basically says only the powers that are specifically granted to the federal government can be exercised by the federal government. So therefore, they've reserved so much autonomy and legal freedom to the states that we had a massive experiment going on a lot. And that experiment produced examples that were then copied if they were successful. So we became successful in many ways. In our educational system became the envy of the world, and it still is. Perhaps less so now than it was 20 years ago, but all of this helped us stay together. And yet, when I observe our society now, I think most of those advantages are diminishing. I think that we have massive wealth disparity now that we haven't had since the 1920s. We no longer have nearly the strong faith-based component that we used to have. I mean, it's still, there are major segments of our population that are highly religious, but the data show that church attendance and religion generally is no longer nearly as forceful as it used to be, and partly because of the wealth disparity, because we are much more ethnically diverse. Immigration has had a major impact in making us look more like a third world country. Now, I'm in favor of immigration. In fact, I'm one of my pitches now is that national borders themselves were originally created for selfish reasons, and they're essentially an historic anachronism now. That doesn't go down too well with patriots, but I can feel patriotic and still see the damage that these national borders are causing, in the sense that they enable huge militaries that couldn't exist but for the size of these nations, like Russia, like China, like the United States. And those militaries are responding to the will of, in those three examples, one person. And I think that's not useful. But that's another topic. I think most of what held us together has diminished. And part of that is certainly the internet and social media. We're a much more fragmented society now culturally. And this is not just happening in the US. I think, whereas we used to have, a few number of principal media outlets, the major networks, now we have tens of thousands of networks people can choose from. And we simply have become more fragmented socially. So that's going on overseas too. So I don't think we're immune to the same influences that cause so many societies recently. I think within the last 15 years, there's been so many examples of countries that have fallen apart.
Mm, mm. Two things that come to mind. One is that I think a lot of people get very fixated on, but our Constitution and the setup of our government is this perfect thing that makes us unbreakable. So that's one thing. And then I'd also like to touch on how much, when we were a more religious country, the benefit of that is the shared values and the shared consensus, right? And so I'm interested to talk as well about how splitting the values, especially bifurcating them, how volatile that makes things for us. So let's start with the sort of glorification of the Constitution and the structure of the American government.
Well, the Constitution, frankly, it was a wise text in the sense that it promoted this balance of power, but it really didn't say much about the power of the executive. Most of the power of our executive branch has been accumulated by actions of the executive branch and the acquiescence of the other two branches. And you really see that in spades these days when the Congress is allowing all sorts of things to happen, like the wars that have been started. The Iran war is a war. There was no declaration of war. The tariffs were directly contradicted by the Constitution, as the Supreme Court fortunately recently held. And even though we have this balance of power spelled out in the Constitution, in fact, what has held us together was the way it was interpreted in the past. And what is at jeopardy now is the fact that it's no longer being interpreted in that manner. And you don't have a really forceful Supreme Court now that's taking positions. We'll see what they say about birthright citizenship and some other things. But I was pleasantly surprised by the tariff decision and whatnot. And I don't think our Constitution, I think it's been worshipped as a document, but in fact, what kept us together was the way we interpreted it, and not so much the text itself, which does not differ so much from text in many other countries that have been nowhere near as successful as we have been. So I don't think it's our textual document. I do think that the rule of law in the United States in the past played a major important part in maintaining that balance of power, and I see that now under threat precisely because we've got two branches that seem to be acquiescing so much in executive power. And I think all societies in part have what I used to call a king instinct. People just, for some reason, they like to have a king or a queen. And I saw that a lot. I saw it in Latin America once. I was in Argentina when there was a big crowd cheering on Eva Perón. She was out on the balcony. And the only thing I could equate it to was people in London worshiping Queen Victoria. But she was the wife of the president, but people were worshiping her like she was the queen. And I like to say that societies, sometimes you see that. They really like to have a strong man in charge. And you're seeing it in Russia. or you have seen it, and maybe it's going to wane at some point, but you see that in Russia. And I speak Russian. I lived in the former Soviet Union. I was trained in Russian, and I've had Russians directly tell me they really like Putin precisely because he's such a strong authoritarian leader. They admire their Tsar.
Mm.
So,
I
and you
think
see a
maybe
bit of that here too.
yeah, I think we underestimate a sort of like what you're describing is almost like a primal or natural desire to have some unified head of authority. And then maybe in the US, there's a blind spot that we don't. I mean, we have in the past had many protections from that going awry that have been loosened. The screws have been loosened in certain areas. And it's tough because so much of the time, people that want to come in and be that person are bad people, are, power hungry and corrupt. So, and then, okay, so let's talk about the shared values for a second. I mean, I don't personally see there being any hope anytime soon in us being able to completely unify or even get one shared consensus in sort of general terms of what we think the US is and what the values it should be, reinforced, and just general values. So, I mean, do you believe that that is as toxic and problematic and dangerous as I might?
Yes, absolutely. I think and I can't suggest any kind of panacea solution to that. The phenomenon that I mentioned about the breakdown of the social consensus, I think it's a worldwide phenomenon. And I mean, this may be wishful thinking, but the world desperately needs some sort of really charismatic spiritual leader to bring people back to what holds us together. And in my mind, it's our relationships, and I think the borders that we have, not just physical borders, but legal borders and other barriers are separating us. I think if we could acknowledge our common humanity, hopefully the artificial intelligence revolution and what it means to language barriers and whatnot will facilitate a lot greater understanding among people that in the best case could bring us together and make us appreciate what we have that's valuable. But it's a dicey situation. To me, it looks like a dicey prospect. I don't really know whether we're going to continue to fragment or not. There's some key milestones that are coming up. The midterm elections here, the eventual decision about Taiwan is one decision that I think is going to be very significant, depending on how that goes, because China seems very serious about, at least blockading it. And I have no clue what would happen. Another thing I worry about is our own military. If they were ordered to do something that is patently illegal, I don't know if the leadership would call the bluff of the commander in chief. I don't know what would happen if they were ordered, for instance, to take Greenland. There's nothing you could call that except a war, an invasion, even if somebody's not fighting back. But it would not be authorized by Congress, and yet it could happen. I'm not predicting any of this, but I just, as I said, believe that we are equally vulnerable. There have been so many. I guess I didn't talk about the most significant breakup that happened in my lifetime was the breakup of the Soviet Union. I don't think people appreciate how quickly and surprised everybody was, including citizens of the Soviet Union. It happened within a week or so. It was just no longer in existence. And then you had many versions of that thereafter in several of the former Soviet states. And I just made a little note. Then you had the Arab Spring, and you had 4 different Arab countries that fell apart rather quickly. And you had 2 revolutions in the country I was posted to, Kyrgyzstan. You had two in Ukraine, the Orange Revolution, and you had another one in 2014. You had the Rose Revolution in Georgia. As I said before we started recording, I haven't tried to historically compare this period to preceding periods, but in my lifetime, the last 15 years have been rather unique in having so many places fall apart. More recently, we had Nepal. There was a major overthrow of that government. You had the same thing is going on in Iran until they were cracked down so brutally recently. So it's happening everywhere.
Mm. That kind of brings me to the question of I think people who have not had the eyewitness accounts that you have, are probably very curious about what actually causes a regime to take over or to fall, right? So you get a lot of different trying to project or saying, oh, this thing that's happening here, we've seen it happen many times in the past in totalitarian regimes. But are there specific things like you've talked about, events where it seemed like to me, some of the things you've talked about, there's a pattern of the government goes one step too far, and either the military or some parts of the population, in terms of an overthrow, will rise up against, and they'll get overthrown. So that's kind of on that side. And then also interested on the side of what has to happen for a regime to sort of properly take over. What are some of those patterns so that we can kind of imagine how that might look here?
I haven't seen a standard recipe for either side. I've seen variations on certainly the way they fall apart. And the military plays a very important role in that in many cases. Is what I've seen that in Latin America. I traveled through Latin America when I was in college at a time when most of those countries were under military dictatorships. And in those cases, the military had simply said, look, enough is enough. We're going to take over. And they informed the president at the time that you're out of here. We're in charge. And then in some cases, they set up elections and they slowly transitioned back to civilian power. And you saw that in Africa, too. Sometimes, more often, what you saw was the strong man that takes power stays there until he dies, and it is a he in the case of Africa. They were, with one exception, they had a woman president in Liberia who was one of the more enlightened, and she stepped aside after an election. But all the rest were men that were simply power hungry, and they come to believe in themselves as some sort of saviors. And then there were other places where it was the crowd, that was what happened in Nepal recently. It happened in Iran unsuccessfully. It happened in Bolivia. It was not what happened in the former Soviet Union. That was more of an institutional breakup. The parliaments voted to terminate their participation in the Soviet Union. They said, nope, we're going to be independent now. Those who made that decision, there were those in Central Asia that were surprised by the whole decision. They were simply informed, guess what, you're independent now. The subsidies are over. And for a long time, they didn't believe it. As for what takes place next, it's really a hodgepodge. And the most common example, I suppose, is they have a constitutional convention of some sort, and it goes by different names. And the Kyrgyz called it a kurultai, which was a term stretching back to the Genghis Khan era, where they would get all the significant leaders in a room or a place, and they would try to reach a consensus on what the guiding document would be, what are going to be the basic rules for the next administration. And in some cases, you'll get somebody who comes along and respects those rules. In other times, especially in Latin America, you'll get new people come in and they say, I don't really like that version of the Constitution. Let's start changing it. And they end up with 50 different constitutions in as many years. As I said, we've been lucky that we've lived under one constitution for so long. But even some of the Western nations like France and Italy, they've had many different constitutions. On the other hand, you had Great Britain that only had its historical precedents, and they don't have a written constitution per se. So they come in all, the solutions come in all shapes and sizes, as do the problems.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so I want to talk about as well individual responsibility. We chatted a little bit about this offline, but how much can we as people, as individuals, make any kind of difference positively and negatively? My impression is that we have more power to do negative things than positive things, unfortunately. But my personal thought is that if we can restore through individual relationships and community groups some sense of a social consensus, right? That we can actually find any shared values we do have in common, maybe more from a humanistic perspective, the humanistic elements in a lot of in maybe the Christian faith and in liberal ideologies and agnostic and all of that. So finding some kind of shared value seems to me one of the number one things that you can do, reducing estrangements with people that you are pitted against as an individual. But beyond that, I mean, what do you think? Do you have any suggestions for anybody of how to empower themselves positively and what they can watch out for negatively that could impact?
Well, I think participation is very important. I think voting is very important, even though as a young person, I often ask myself, well, what the hell difference is my vote going to make? And the answer is not much, but it's precisely the collection of not much from a lot of different people that does make a difference. So if you don't participate at all, you're basically giving up. So I think participation is very important. And I think your words have so much impact on people you relate to. And I think what you're doing in your podcast, what people do in their writing, what people do when they're talking to their friends and their families, they matter. That matters. I think saying what it is you feel and why you feel that way is important. And I think that if there's more communication, at some point, hopefully the good ideas will catch wind and will start to impact society. And when you think about it, virtually every major social change, whether it was from the origin of certain religions, whether it was Buddhism or Confucianism or Christianity or Islam, or even political movements like communism, they started by small groups of people talking to each other and talking about their ideas. So that's how these ideas spread. And so it matters what you're saying to your friends. And I think the extent to which you can at least study the topics that you're talking about, study the history of those topics, and then share your thoughts and ideas about them, that's the most you can expect. Early in my career, somebody made the statement that, we all work on the margin of forces we barely understand. And that phrase stuck with me for so long because I still see it. I think that it's impossible to predict why the winds of social consensus blow in the directions they blow. But the only way I know to have any impact on those social winds is to talk about what you think is important. And there are service groups that I think play an important role in the U.S., the groups like the Rotary, the Kiwanis, and groups that their stated purpose is to serve their community. I'm a member of the local Rotary, and before that I was a Kiwanian in Eastern Washington State. And those groups are important. The churches are important, but it's what you say and what you write that will help to influence society. And it's always going to be a collection of everybody's effort. I can't tell you why, as I said, the collective mass of ideas move in one direction or the other. But what I'm seeing right now in the U.S. is quite troubling when I see all this distrust that's spreading on both sides.
Mm,
Or not, there are more than two sides, I suppose, but it's spreading.
yeah. And the do you have any suggestions for what, and I think this is probably the same answer, but what are some things that we can do to reduce fragility of the US, and maybe externally and individually?
Well, one of my beliefs is that the gun laws in this country are insane. I think that that's one thing we could take a position on and work to try and uh, remove some of the tools of violence, and those are certainly very important tools. And I don't think it would be out of place to try and do that. I'm not a member of the NRA, as you might guess. Other than that, you're right. What I think that um, one thing that can help is try to learn another language. I mean, you will be surprised at how you feel if and when you do that. It's like growing another soul. You start to feel differently about whatever it is you're talking about. You laugh at things that aren't even funny in your language and whatnot, and you can understand people in a way that's very different if you're working through a translator. So I've had the good luck of being forced to learn. Well, first it was Spanish, but then later I was sent to school to learn French and Russian, and I learned that when you can speak to people from another culture in their native tongue, you feel different, and that impacts you. It changes the way you see the world, and I think that's so I'm telling my kids. I have 5 kids, and I'm telling every one of them, I want you to learn another language. 2 of them have done that. 3 of them wonder why daddy's crazy, but
Can't win them all.
yeah.
That makes me think of just learning in general, expanding knowledge, and the pitfalls that we have right now of people listening to the wrong sources of information or not really educating themselves on the history of things and making very sweeping statements, sort of the fake news idea.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so do you have any thoughts around that and things that you think can be avoided? I think some people even feel like, how the hell do I even know that I'm getting the right information?
I'll go back to something else we mentioned before we started recording. I was I grew up in the Cold War, and at the time the Soviet Union was demonized by our press, and I guess we were demonized in their press. And when I got there, and I lived there for 3.5 years, I never heard anybody complain about it. They're good people, and the cities were beautiful. People missed it. They really liked it. And there's an old Chinese philosopher, I've forgotten his name, but he made the point once that he thought everybody was essentially good, because his example was, if any adult sees a child sitting on the side of a well and is about to fall in, that adult will naturally feel an impulse to run over there and save that child. I think I think he's right. I think everybody feels that kind of impulse. At the bottom, we're not bad people.
Mm.
Um, where we go wrong is when we start believing that other people are bad, and they're not. I really believe that, and I think if people said that more and thought about it more, they would see what I'm talking about. The people in China are not evil bastards, and the people in the former Soviet Union were not evil bastards. The very concept of communism, for instance, was founded on this idea of equality. It was cooked up by a guy who was offended by all the wealth disparity in England, by Karl Marx. He thought, this is crazy that you've got people living in poorhouses, working in factories with abominable conditions, working 12, 15 hours a day, throwing their human waste out in the streets, and yet you had these incredibly rich people. So he cooked up this ideology, and it took hold. It didn't take hold because of evil people. It took hold because it was directed at human equality. So when I first started writing my book, I wanted to call it The Better Angels of Foreign Aid, and I was talked out of that. They thought it would be more interesting, or from a marketing standpoint, if we called it Inside USAID. But I think that foreign aid itself is a reflection of our better angels, and I was very privileged to work in that area for so many years. Um, and so I think that, well, that's my pitch. I think if people just started to believe that the other side, whether it's an internal political division or whether it's an international ideology of some sort, if people could believe that those people are trying to do the right thing as they see it, then I think we could hopefully come together. But that's not happening right now.
Yeah. Wow. Well, let's talk about your book a little bit. So it basically covers all of the different things that you came across. I mean, tell us what it's about and kind of how you decided to write it and what the message is there.
Well, it's actually the second book that I wrote, but the first one I didn't finish the story. I called it Dilettante, and in part that's because that's kind of what I felt I was. I had given up a career I was a partner in a commercial law firm, and I gave it up to basically dabble in thousands of different topics. And that, what I tell people is that our foreign aid agency was essentially the tool that we used to do anything overseas that wasn't purely diplomacy and wasn't a military response. So the range of activity is incredibly broad. And I know a lot of the press has focused on the humanitarian side of USAID, the disaster assistance and the health programs, but we did everything. I mean, we dabbled, for instance, when the Soviet Union fell apart, we brought in accountants and lawyers to train people on how markets functioned. When smoke from forest fires came up into Texas and Florida from northern Guatemala, it was USAID got the call. What are you going to do about that? Go get some tankers and dump water on those fires. We created entire industries in Central America that help people earn their living. We sent for instance, I just give one example that I have time for now. We sent a container full of onions over to Miami one year and discovered that onions can be grown in Honduras and marketed in the U.S. at a time when they don't have them up here because it's not harvest season. And 10 years later, 500,000 people are making their living growing onions. And we did the same thing with cantaloupes and melons and shrimp farms and flowers. And we created all kinds of industries. When environmentalists in Central America were worried that the animals couldn't go back and forth, USAID was asked to get the governments together to negotiate a whole series of national parks so that the animals could go back and forth in a contiguous zone without national or road barriers and whatnot. I could continue to give examples, but it just covers the waterfront in terms of the scope of human activity. So it's not just the humanitarian and the health work that we did. It's a difficult agency to describe in that sense. And I just give a taste of that in the book, but most of it is basically tracking my own career through these different countries where chaos seemed to follow me around. For some reason, I was, every time I went somewhere, it seemed like either it had just fallen apart, or it was about to fall apart, sometimes while I was there. So it's my own personal story for the most part, but there is enough background at the beginning of the book to give people a sense of what USAID really was and the variety of work that it did. And that was essentially the message. I mean, I wrote most of it way before this most recent event in 2025, when Elon Musk was given the freedom to throw it in the wood chipper, as he's bragged about. I don't think he ever visited a USAID project. I don't think he realized what he was destroying when he did that. And I personally saw hundreds of people, thousands of people lost their careers, very dedicated people, and they're scrambling now. Most of them are scrambling. So it was in part anger that made me, finish the story with the second book and finish the first book just got me into Africa in 1987. And the book that came out last year finishes the tale and basically takes me through the rest of my own career, which it ended at the end of 2016. So that's what the book's about.
Mm. You know, they had all those things at the time that it was shut down, um, about, oh, they have this frivolous thing here and this weird thing there. And I don't know if you want to speak to that, because you've said to me it's anything that's not military action that we do abroad. So surely there are going to be certain, projects off here and there, but the large portion are huge infrastructure efforts and economic efforts and things like that. So do you want to speak to some of those sort of accusations, if
Well,
you will?
where
I
I
have
worked, most of it was meetings, and what we would do, and this is not to say we did do infrastructure projects in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and uh, but most of what we did were large educational projects. Now you can pick the topic. You can say we would like to improve our tax collection, the efficiency of our tax agency. So we bring in experts that sit down with the government people and they discuss what it is you're doing now that isn't working and what you could do better. So it's a lot of meetings and it's a lot of consensus building. Or we'll go into small communities in the upper mountains of Peru and we'll say, this is why public health here is such a problem. You don't have the right kind of water systems. You're not treating your water correctly. In Guatemala, we promoted uh, loans to villages that would allow them to hook up to the national electricity grid. And we didn't pay for the material. We loaned the villages, or we guaranteed. We didn't even do that. We signed guarantees so that U.S. investors would loan the money. And we had one program that over 300 villages got these small loans that financed the equipment, and the villagers had to do the work, and they connected themselves to the national electrical grid. And it didn't cost the U.S. taxpayer a dime because, in fact, we made money on it. The investors paid us money in exchange for our guarantee. But when the program finished, we had 300 villages that now had electricity, which makes an enormous difference in their lives. They can run power equipment. They can keep their medicines cold. They can keep food cold. They can listen to the national radio. They can watch TV. The kids have light to study with. I mean, it just changes everything when you have electricity. Um, Again, I could go on and on and on. We did so many things, but we weren't building in most of the places. What we did was we were getting people together to talk about how they could do something better that they wanted to do. Sometimes, for instance, in Kyrgyzstan, it was getting farm implement dealers to come together to organize business associations so that they could lobby their own government to have better policies that would allow the importation of some of the inputs they needed for the agricultural industry in the southern part of Kyrgyzstan. Or why are so many people stealing electricity from the national grid? What can you do to prevent that? And how can you meter this stuff uh, to better collect the electricity that is being smuggled north into Kazakhstan in exchange for under the table payments to senior people in the energy department? My own wife was kidnapped in Kyrgyzstan because I was a little too outspoken about that problem. She got loose and she's okay, but that's one of the stories. As I say, it's an enormous variety of programs that typically paid for a lot of travel and meetings and studies so that we could evaluate how those governments could better manage their own economies. And it worked. It worked if they already wanted the help in a given area. Where it didn't work were areas like teaching farmers how to grow something besides coca. Well, that was pretty hopeless. And I was in charge of a program in Colombia that was trying to do that, get people to grow chocolate beans, cacao, instead of coca. 20 years later, uh, Colombia is still one of the biggest cocaine producers in the world, despite literally hundreds of millions of dollars we spent trying to persuade the farmers not to do that. That was not the problem. The problem is the drug demand up here. Or in our democracy promotion efforts. At one point, it became the fad to promote democracy everywhere. And in the former Soviet Union, quite often they were quite happy. No, thank you. We like being the authoritarian regime we have, and we're not interested in democracy assistance. In other places, it worked, but so I'm critical in many parts of the book about some of our programs, particularly the democracy building programs in places where they didn't want that help, and also the counter drug efforts. But most of it was just it was a massive educational program everywhere we went to teach people either in villages or at the national level how to do things better.
I have kind of a big question to throw your way, and we can dive into it if you want to or pass. But on this idea of what the U.S. can actually accomplish abroad, obviously the low-hanging fruit here is something like Iran, or when we've gone into some of the Middle Eastern countries to try to help with regime change or with things like that. What do you feel like the U.S. can actually give to a place, whether it be through USAID efforts and things like and education, things like that, or military action? I mean, I'd be interested in your frank opinion.
I honestly don't think the military, except perhaps with Ukraine, I don't think the military response is going to be particularly useful in changing other regimes. I think we should be focusing on working together with allies to present a united front, whether it's for purposes of trade or for purposes of economic sanctions and that sort of thing. I think we have to work with other countries. The idea that we can do these things alone is insane. We're not going to change China all by ourselves. They've got enough market opportunity everywhere else in the world that our position is not going to make that much difference to them. In other cases, in the Middle East, I think it's working with our allies and other like-minded countries to present a united front with respect to the rules of engagement, the rules of the trade regime, and the security regime. But I really don't think the military itself is going to be an appropriate or effective response, with the exception right now of Ukraine, where apparently it is making a difference.
Well, thank you so much for all of this. This has been a very enlightening discussion. Is there anything else that you'd like to speak to that you are passionate about or on this topic you'd like to address?
I think we've covered it. You've heard my shtick. I do write about some of my ideas on a Substack. It's cliffordbrown.substack.com, and I have a web page. It's Clifford H. Brown, and there are links to that. The H is important because there was a black trumpet player in the 1930s with my name, but I'm not him. So that's I'm delighted you're doing the podcast you do, Rebecca. I think, as I said, it's important to talk about the ideas you think are important, and this is what you're doing. So
thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.